there's so much accompaniment and sensitivity that's needed on this issue for the whole family, not just the people living with those identifying as trans, but those individuals who identify as trans. Okay, do they feel seen by the church? Do they feel loved by the church? That's our job to do that, making sure that the way we talk about this subject is with reverence and not just kind of an us, them mentality, but it's like, look, all of us struggle with our sexuality in one way or another. It might be like, am I the man or the husband God wants me to be? Or maybe it's, I struggle with my sexuality as a behavior, not so much as an identity. Like, we're all wrestling in this together. The whole church isn't, like they say, a museum of saints. It's more a hospital of sinners. So our job is to make them feel that this is your home too, and that we love you. Christ sees you. In fact, he's the only one that truly sees you, and he loves you.
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. Today I am really happy to be able to welcome Jason Evert, who many people will have heard of as one of the foremost chastity speakers in the world, and who has taken on a very big subject recently in his latest book, Male, Female, Other, which CTS will be publishing later in the year. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. It's good to be on with you.
So if I may do a little bit of an introduction. So Jason's spoken to over 2 million young people about the virtue of chastity. He's a best-selling author of, I think, coming up to 20 books, including the Theology of the Body for Teens and How to Find Your Soulmate Without Losing Your Soul. He earned a master's degree in theology as well as undergraduate degrees in counseling and theology from the Catholic powerhouse that is Franciscan University of Steubenville. And Jason and his wife, Kristalina, live in Denver with their 8 children. So you've got one more than me then.
Slacker.
I know. And you're in Denver, which is a very important place, actually. In my journey of faith, I was there for the World Youth Day in 1993, and that was a wonderful experience, seeing John Paul II there.
I was there as well. I think I was just about a senior in high school at the time. And so we did live out in Denver for about 7 years, but not long ago we moved to Arizona just to be closer to family. So that's where we're at right now. But yeah, living in Denver was amazing, and World Youth Day for sure was unforgettable.
It was a great moment. You know, I think everybody thought that the youth of America aren't interested anymore, and that really put paid to that idea. And it was a real moment of renewal, I think, no?
Yeah, I remember the John Paul's biographer explained that when the Holy Father's helicopter was landing at the stadium, the helicopter pilot said you could actually feel atmospheric disturbance because of the roar of the teenagers as the helicopter was coming down. The pilot could actually feel it in the helicopter because of how the young people were cheering for John Paul's arrival.
Yeah, it was a fantastic moment. So, Jason, tell me a bit about your story. I mean, what was your kind of faith journey, and what inspired you to become, the chastity guy?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a good Catholic household, but didn't really, kind of sat on the fence with my faith for much of high school, but then was able to go through a great youth group program called Life Teen at our parish. That started getting me engaged in the faith. And then ended up at Franciscan University, which was a really pivotal 4 years for me of formation. And during that time at the college, I helped lead high school retreats, local youth groups, and those kids really started opening up with me the struggles they were having, and so much of it had to do with human sexuality, chastity, or the lack thereof. And then also I was doing crisis pregnancy counseling, talking to women who were about to have an abortion to kind of give them some other options and alternatives. And I really started feeling late talking to those women. Like, okay, why am I meeting this woman who's having an abortion in 45 minutes? Why couldn't I have met her when she was 15 years old? Because maybe if she learned about chastity then, she never would have dated this guy to begin with and be in this difficult situation. So I realized if you really want to save the most unborn babies, you don't do it by focusing on the supply of abortion at the clinics. You focus on the demand for abortion, which is unchastity. And so if we can kind of address that issue, then it's like we're plugging a dam instead of throwing sandbags on the banks of a flooded river. So started learning more about chastity, John Paul's Theology of the Body, Love and Responsibility, started sharing that with the young people. And they really, the eyes were being opened, their hearts were open. They loved the way that he presented the message of the demands of authentic human love. Started speaking at high schools, then it was conferences, and then stadiums, and then I've been doing it now for 26 years so far.
It's amazing. And as I read on your website, what is it, 2 million or so have been spoken to so far. That's amazing. I mean, it's a bit of a contrast, actually, to the situation here in the UK, where I would say kind of chastity, bit of a dirty word in a sense. You know, that kind of movement never really took off here. Would you say that what would you say is the reason that it's been bigger in the States, and would you say that the whole movement has been a kind of success? I mean, I think here sometimes we often look over at the stuff that happens in the States and things like, the chastity rings and all these things. They seem very strange to us in a sense. But what's your sort of assessment after doing this for 25 years of how the whole kind of chastity movement, especially for the young people in schools and stuff, has it had an effect? Is it getting more difficult? How do you find it?
Yeah, well, I think there is a unique cynicism of sorts in the UK. I remember when my wife and I were engaged, we got a phone call from the BBC, and they wanted to do a documentary on our engagement because they heard that we were neither living together nor sleeping together. So apparently, news traveled to England that there's an American couple not cohabiting. So they sent out the camera crews and asked us all these questions as to why we weren't sleeping together. And then they mailed us the footage when it had aired for all the United Kingdom to see. And the TV show is called Anna in Wonderland. And it's about the woman who interviewed us, Anna, who visits different bizarre cultures around the globe and then reports on their strange behavior back to England. And the credits of the show are rolling, and it said, join us next week when Anna visits a colony of vampires. So like 1 week is the vampires, next week is, my wife and I. But John Paul II pointed out in his book, Love and Responsibility, this isn't just like a UK issue. He said this is the resentment that we have towards chastity as a globe right now. It has this negative connotation, this frigid, prudish, repressive, Victorian idea that just poo-poos sexuality as some dirty thing. But that's not what it is at all. I think the reason it's taken off in America versus the UK is because it's been taught here. And I think if young people just get the chance to hear what it is, they'll want it. I remember Steve Jobs, who founded the Apple company, he said, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. And I think that's especially true of chastity because it's a virtue that frees you to love, because if you can't say no to your sexual impulses, saying yes to them means nothing. And it also frees you to know if you're authentically being loved. Okay, does this person love me, or do they only want the pleasure that they're getting from me? And so chastity is the virtue that frees you to love. And I think if we explain it in that way, instead of sex is bad and you're going to get pregnant and die of an STD and go to hell, who's going to want that? And so I think the reason it's taken off here is just because the young people have had the chance to hear it. And maybe they haven't heard it from the pulpits or from the media there in the UK.
So would you say this was something that really grew out of the discourse that John Paul II began in his, I suppose he began with Love and Responsibility, but then kind of popularized it a bit more at the beginning of his pontificate? Was that the kind of the real inspiration for this movement, at least in the Catholic Church? Within the Catholic Church, I would say yes. Yeah.
But within the mainstream culture, there was a lot of promotion of safe sex within the public schools in particular. And this didn't work. We saw an astronomical rise in sexual activity, teen pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases. Like, it didn't work. Like, they were throwing gasoline on a fire to put the thing out. And so the federal government intervened and started pumping millions of dollars in federal funding to abstinence education in the public schools with no religious content whatsoever. And so largely evangelicals took advantage of that grant money and started teaching abstinence in the public schools, which led to a big push of abstinence in the culture. But that's not really the fullness of chastity. Abstinence is just no sex. Chastity is a virtue. It's a lot more full than that. And so the chastity movement within the church, I would say, had its roots in John Paul II, but within evangelical Christianity, it was largely federal funding that was made available to teach this within the public schools.
That's very interesting. I mean, it must have been, obviously we're talking in the kind of post post 68 summer of love, the sexual revolution has been kind of going at a pace. So in a sense, we've been speaking in a very how can one say, going against the grain, against the stream of the culture, and obviously that's been good training for you to start speaking about something which is even more has become kind of even more controversial. So why did you feel that really it was the moment to start speaking about gender now? And did you see that as like a natural kind of next step after speaking about chastity and sexuality? Because it's got a kind of strange kind of crossover with the whole kind of sexual revolution. In some ways it has caused kind of problems, and there are arguments against it from all sides of the kind of LGBT kind of angle. So can you tell me a bit about how you saw that those two movements kind of going into each other?
Honestly, I didn't even see this on the radar 10, 15 years ago. And then it's just taken this kind of hockey stick acceleration where everywhere I go, the kids are coming up to me after the talk and like, hi, I identify as non-binary and my pronouns are they, them. And I'm trying to talk to my mom about it and she's screaming at me. And then you talk to the parents and they're like, look, I don't know what to do. My kid wants a double mastectomy and they don't even have a driver's license yet. Or I've got an adult son who's transitioning and I'm just wondering, what did I do wrong as a parent? And so every school and parish I was going to, this became this universal problem, predominantly among adolescent females who are spending a lot of time on social media. And so I would talk to these kids and just especially listen, not just try to like win a debate. Well, your chromosomes say this. It's more like, well, tell me about that. When did that start coming up in your life? And what is that like? And just trying to ask them questions, listening in a sense to that dysphoria with kind of a reverent curiosity, because I believe there's a story behind everybody that needs to be heard. I remember meeting one boy and he said he was trans and we talked for a long time. And I said, well, tell me about your family. And he said, I've got 2 older sisters and 2 younger sisters. But he's like, you know what? They can do no wrong. My parents love them. They're so affectionate towards them, but I'm the black sheep of the family. But I got straight A's and I'm on the swim team, but nothing I do is ever good enough for my parents. I said, well, do you think if you were born a girl, you would have been loved the way your sisters are loved? And he looked at me and he said, I know I would have been. And to me, like, okay, here we are. The ache wasn't to be female. The ache was to be loved. And he saw a feminine identity as his pathway to the parental affirmation he never received. And so that was kind of his story, but he didn't realize it. He was just replacing it with a label of just trans. But there's so many layers of complexity. I remember meeting one girl and her sister was getting a double mastectomy and they had been abandoned by their dad as little girls. And she asked the sister, well, why are you going through with this surgery? And she said, you'll see. She said, I'll be a better man than dad ever was. And it's like, whoa, like there's a lot of stuff going on here. I mean, that's why I know one anesthesiologist who won't give anesthesia in his hospital to any patient doing this. And he's not some transphobic bigot. He said, look, I've seen the medical charts, the autism, the anxiety, the depressive disorders, the OCD, the trauma, the sexual abuse. And he said, we're just collaborating with mental illness at this point instead of actually treating it. He said, this is malpractice. It's going to go down as one of the greatest medical scandals of the last 100 years.
I mean, we'll come back to those kinds of details and examples a bit later, if I may.
Oh yeah.
But I think it's interesting to look at really the kind of rapidity with which this became like a thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've got to say, I remember probably about 5 or 6 years ago reading an article online, and it was in a university newspaper, and it used an expression that I'd never seen before. It was like cisgender. Mm-hmm. And I looked it up. I thought, oh, it's strange. So, this is somebody who identifies as the gender that they were assigned at birth. And I thought, okay, well, this is just sort of crazy university stuff, and we don't need to worry about it. Mm-hmm. Me and maybe my children's children will need to deal with it. But for now, I think we can ignore it. And I think within a year, it was pretty much all over the place. I remember walking down the road in my little part of southeast London, and seeing a bunch of name tags outside a house that had just had a party, and there was preferred pronoun written on it. And I was like, it's gone from kind of crazy university campus stuff to suburban London within a year. So I mean, and I suppose in one sense, what happened, the rapidity with which it happened caught everybody by surprise. And the church herself has had to kind of really think about how to respond to this. I mean, partly, I suppose one question would be, why do you think that it's been so fast? And have we done what have we responded well enough as a church?
Well, one, we have not responded well enough as a church, but we can get back to that. Why the rapidity of this ascent of transgender identification among young people? I'd say it's largely social media, because you look when these numbers really just went through the roof. It was pretty much the same year Instagram came into being. And then we had TikTok and Snapchat. And so what you have is unprecedented numbers of young people, especially during COVID, basically isolated from each other, locked in their own rooms with their own iPads and iPhones, often feeling a bit alienated from their peers and maybe the outlier, that I don't feel like I fit in with the other girls. Well, what explains this? And then they're finding these reels of like, well, you might be non-binary and you might be this and that. And they're discovering almost a language that resonates with their lived experience. And so it's like, yeah, I've always felt that way, but I've never been able to put a word on it. And now I found the word. And I feel like I'm understood by this kind of online community who gets me when I'm even a mystery to my own self. And so all of us long for this sense of identity, of community, and of mission. And this thing of gender almost provides all of them at the same time. Here's your identity, and here's your online community, and here's your mission as kind of a victimized minority. And so that's why if you really question this at all, you get this anaphylactic reaction from them. And it's like, whoa, well, like I just asked you a question about this and I'm getting screamed at. What we're almost like, it's almost like treating a burn victim. The levels of sensitivity that are required because of how much people's lives get wrapped up in this identity and community and mission. And so to me, the reason we saw this skyrocketing was because of social media. We also saw an inversion of the sex ratio. We've got more than 100 years of psychological literature on this, and it's always been gender dysphoria, middle-aged men for whom it was more of a sexual fetish thing, in very young boys. That's the way it had always been. But then all of a sudden, shoot, it flipped, and we saw the skyrocketing numbers of the teenage girls, not the middle-aged women. You don't have 35-year-old moms coming out as non-binary. Like, it's not happening. It's all these adolescent females, often on the autistic spectrum. About 42% of them meet the criterion for an autistic diagnosis. All of these girls at the same time, just boom, spending a ton of time on social media. So to me, if I had to put the finger on any specific thing, and there's a lot of cultural strains and philosophical ones that lead in behind this, but I'd say for sure, social media was the gasoline thrown on this fire.
Yeah. So yeah, as you say, there is a kind of intellectual, in inverted commas, hinterland to this whole movement. So can you tell us, I mean, this kind of comes up in the book, but can you tell us a little bit about, where does this idea kind of come from, and when was gender and sex kind of separate? When were they sort of separated from each other?
Well, at least in the English language, I mean, the Greek root of the word gender simply means the manner in which one generates. So that's pretty straightforward. It's one or the other. Sperm or egg, there's no third option there. And it wasn't until about the 14th century that word gender appears in the English language, but it was in reference to grammar, that noun is masculine, feminine, or neuter. And throughout history, that's predominantly the way in which it was used. And about the 14th, 15th century, we see it used for the first time as a synonym for biological sex, like a gender reveal party. But still, that was not the way it was mainly used. Typically just language, grammar. It wasn't until 1955 that the psychologist Dr. John Money, who was also a pedophile, was the first one to use it in the sense of gender roles, meaning the way that our biological sex is lived out in our culture. But then after that, we saw this just unbelievable multiplication of the word, from transgender, non-binary, all of this in the last 10, 15 years. And it's not to say that nobody experienced gender dysphoria before the word was coined, just recently, in terms of transgenderism. But we saw, at least in the medical literature, things shifted in the 1950s. The feminists kind of jumped onto this idea of saying, look, gender is a social construct. Men, women, it's basically the same thing. You began to see this blurring of our sexual differences as men and women. And I think instead of just rejecting that, we've got to affirm, okay, yeah, there's some truth to that society does play the role in a way that I live out my masculinity or femininity. There's some truth to that. But they went too far, that it's all just nurture. It's not really nature. And I think a healthier way is to blend it. It's part nature and it's part nurture. We are different. But the interesting thing is, the more egalitarian you make a society, meaning men and women can choose whatever career path they want, the more even you make it, the more we bend towards our gender stereotypical roles. The guys want to be the electricians, the women, want to be the dental hygienists. Like, why is that happening? Because we're different at our core. But our identity isn't defined by our stereotypes, which to me is the big problem that gender theory commits. It basically takes these gender stereotypes and lets them determine our identity. Well, I don't fit with the other guys. I guess I'm not part of the club.
And it has this kind of strange circular kind of logic in that it takes those stereotypes and then says that they mean nothing, and then reapplies them once somebody has kind of made the decision to change sex.
Yeah,
that just seems to be like a very strange kind of internal lack of logic that just doesn't. I mean, why is that? I don't understand why that's not being more. Why that hasn't been a kind of stronger argument against the idea.
Yeah, no, to me, it's almost like feminism is starting to cannibalize itself. It's almost like you have a snake that kind of starts to swallow its own tail, and then it gets back up to its head, and it's like, okay, what do I do now? Like, it's kind of stuck. And the way I look at the gender stereotypes, gender theory, gender stereotypes try to get a person to conform their personality to match their body. Meaning your body is male, so you better behave like this. Gender theory commits the opposite mistake of trying to get a person to conform their body to match their personality. Meaning your personality is a little more feminine. Well, let's mutilate the body to match the personality. But neither one of these to me is the right approach. To me, the healthier approach is to realize that you're not born into the wrong body. You're born into a wrong culture if it's telling you have to hurt your body to be yourself. Okay, like your body doesn't need to be reconstructed. Our culture needs to be reconstructed.
So, I mean, do you think that as Catholics and as people who kind of believe in a sense in the givenness of what we are, I mean, is it even legitimate for us to kind of distinguish between sex and gender? Or should we just take an approach where we say, okay, no, let's just forget, let's not use that language. Let's kind of try to go back to maybe just using sex as a determinative.
Yeah, I think the language of sexual identity is much more helpful than gender, because gender is such a confusing word. I mean, you could have two people discussing it meaning totally different things. One person who's not familiar with gender theory could be like, well, what's gender? And then the person who's doing like gender studies at some university be like, oh, well, that's your internal sense of being male, female, both, or neither. It's like, okay, so you're telling me at a gender reveal party, they're revealing the unborn baby's internal sense of identity? Like, no, they're just revealing the baby's sex. Okay, so sex is gender? No. Gender is more, your inner sense of how you present as male or female. It's like, well, wait a minute, now we're referring back to sex. It's such a confusing word. And so I recommend let's stick with the word sexual identity rather than gender. If we do want to use gender, I think what's important as a Catholic is that it could be distinguished from sex in the sense that your gender could be your biological sex lived out, or the social expressions of masculinity and femininity. So there's a sense in which we could distinguish it from sex, but the key is we can't divorce it from sex. That's the problem. That is where we break from Catholic understanding of what it means to be human. If you can have sex here, a complete split, and then gender over here. This is like a dualism. The idea that I'm not really my body, that my body is something other than me. This is kind of the foundational philosophical framework of gender theory. I'm not really my body. Whereas the Catholic understanding is more of an integrated vision of man, that I don't just have a body like I have a pair of jeans, like my body is me. That's why if they say like, I'm going to the store, well, your body's going to the store as well, because your body is you.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, being Catholic is always great, because the church has usually confronted most problems that come up already in her history. I mean, do you think that? And some people speak about this as a kind of Gnostic, a kind of return of a Gnostic heresy, or this you mentioned dualism. Do you think that's a kind of useful paradigm to use? Is there something that we can usefully gain from the experience of the early church in battling the Gnostics?
Oh, for sure. I think when these cultural things hit, it really gives us an opportunity to really rediscover, what does it mean to be human? Like, what does it mean to be a man? I remember reading one author, and he said the very fact that we're even asking the question, what is a woman? And we're not even coming up with a coherent answer as a society. He said it's almost like a facial slur, or a slur of speech or a droop indicating a stroke in the brain. It's this external sign that something big has gone wrong. And so the very fact that we can't even answer in a coherent way, what does it mean to woman? Well, a woman is anyone who says they're a woman. Like, wait a minute, that's the best we can do here? A woman is one who identifies as one. Well, you're just repeating the word, you're not actually defining it. So to me, it's a really good opportunity for the church to say, okay, what does it mean to be a woman? What is God's plan for masculinity, femininity? Because the world is starving for this. And I think John Paul II, through his Theology of the Body, through the inspiration he got from the Holy Spirit, gave us the answer like 30 years ago. And now we're just gradually unpacking it of what does it mean to be human, and why is the core premise of the Theology of the Body, which is the spousal meaning of the body, that our differences as men and women not only reveals our identity, it reveals our calling to make a gift of ourselves. And then life makes sense. The devil wants to obscure that as much as possible. So the end game of gender theory isn't to have like 58 genders. It's to erase the spousal meaning of the body, to kind of obscure our sexual complementarity. So that way it isn't male, female. It could be this, it could be that. It's up to you. It just basically obscures the divine design that he's implanted in our bodies to reveal even himself and our calling to live like him.
I mean, one of the things I really liked about the way that you approached things in the book is you gave these kind of statements that are often really kind of repeated without thoughts. I think now, especially in the media, on social media, as you say, as well. And some of these statements are really kind of counterintuitive in a sense, and you go. It's an incredibly well-researched book, lots of footnotes, but at the same time, very, very easily kind of understandable. And I mean, one of the things that one of the questions that you asked is real basic one. It's kind of, why does God make us male and female? And I mean, I suppose that begs another question, which is, does all of this come out of a kind of rejection that we're created at all? I mean, what's the complementarity of male and female all about, and why is it that we can't kind of just move between them?
Yeah, well, John Paul II in his Theology of the Body, he uses this analogy of a triptych. So a triptych is a 3-paneled work of art. And when you see the full thing, you get the full picture of what the artist wanted to reveal. And so he said that's kind of like how God is revealing, us to ourselves. We had original man. That's who we were before original sin. There was unity between God and man, between the man and the woman, between the body and the soul. There was this original harmony, unity, happiness. Then we had original sin. And with that came concupiscence, kind of these darkened intellects, our weakened wills, our disordered appetites. But then we were redeemed by Christ and we're living in grace, but still struggling with sin. That's historical man. And then the final panel was eschatological man, who we're going to be with God for all eternity, body and soul in heaven. That's the full picture of what it means to be human. Our challenge is that we're kind of dropped into this historical narrative right in the middle. It's almost like we're walking into a movie 45 minutes late, trying to figure out who's the good guy, what's the whole plot. And what this means is that for a lot of people, if we experience an inclination, a temptation, an attraction, we'll just assume I am who God made me to be. Like, if I have this feeling, then it's who God wants me to be. I'm made this way. God made me this way. It's like, well, wait a minute, this is kind of confusing historical man with original man, meaning like any impulses or desires I have are basically given the approval by God by virtue of the fact that I have them. Instead of realizing, well, original sin is a real thing. And so we've got to realize that just because we feel inclined towards something doesn't mean that it was God's original plan for us to live that out. His original plan is what we saw with Adam and Eve, that in their bodies, they could see the other person's naked body. And because of the purity of the heart, they could see their call to love that person as God loved them. But what with original sin came this obscuring of the vision of the body. So no longer did the woman's body become this invitation of love. It was like this invitation of lust and of using. And so she obviously covered herself in shame, not because she's ashamed of herself, but as modesty, as a protection from being used. And so God's original plan for man and woman was that in their bodies, they would image his love, because God is love. And that means that we are made in the image and likeness of a God who is this eternal exchange of life-giving love. And a husband and a wife make that visible by the way that they love each other. This is kind of John Paul's theology of the body. And so masculinity and femininity are not just 2 points on a spectrum. This is as diverse as it gets, man and woman. We don't need to add more genders to add diversity. We already have ultimate diversity. We have ultimate complementarity. But unfortunately, there's this Marxist idea of looking at our sexes in this dialectical way, that's this battle of the sexes. And that in order to have real freedom, we have to erase sexual distinctions, eliminate class distinctions, and then we'll have utopia. And so get rid of male-female differences, then we're all going to be free. That's kind of the Marxist underpinning of this idea of gender theory, viewing our sexual differences as a threat instead of an invitation to love.
So one thing that I think is quite interesting and sits in the background of a lot of the problems that we're encountering in kind of Western societies in particular is that in order to be kind, in order to be accepting, in order to be open, and this is, I think, is reflected often within the church as well, that we're not able to speak out against anything that we see to be wrong. Rather, what we need to do is we need to affirm, we need to be welcoming, we need to speak well of whatever we see, whatever comes towards us. And I mean, in the people's everyday life, and one of the questions that you bring up, which I think is really important, is whether we should actually use people's preferred pronouns. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, there's a pressure to be nice, to be kind, and so in that sense, I mean, or do we need to be truthful? I mean, what's the balance there? How do we strike that balance in our everyday lives?
Yeah, I think it can sometimes be challenging to find that line with charity and clarity of how to blend those things together. And I believe this does need to be taken on a case-by-case basis. And what I mean by that is, I know one mom and the teenage daughter came up to the mom and said, "Mom, I am non-binary and my pronouns are they and them." And the mom's like, "Okay, well, they need to go clean their room." And just kind of dropped it like that. And she wasn't wanting to get in some big debate with the girl over the thing. But in the same respect, I think we've got to realize, okay, your kid comes to you and says, my pronouns are this and them. You don't just say, okay, well, I need to affirm, your perception of reality, because then I'm not loving you. Now, that's misguided mercy. That's false compassion. In fact, I was speaking recently to a woman who had detransitioned. She got puberty blockers, I think 14 cross-sex hormones at 15. She got a double mastectomy at 16. And then at 17 years old, she's like, what did I do to my body? Like, what did you adults let me do to my body? And now she's suing the gender clinic and doing all these things. And I asked her, as a parent, if your kid comes to you and says, Mom, I'm trans, non-binary, what would you recommend? And what would you recommend not doing? And she said, under no circumstances should you use their preferred pronoun because you're entertaining their delusion. And they look at you as an arbiter of reality and truth. And if you just go along with the social transitioning of like, yep, you're a girl, you're a boy, she said that's the worst thing you could do for your kid, even if they have a fit over it. And so what I would say to the kid is, look, I love you and I don't want to hurt you. And I know this is really important to you. But you also know because I love you, I can't lie to you. And I feel if I were to use that word to describe you, I feel like I'm being dishonest with you. And I hope you know that I don't reject you because you feel this. And I really hope you don't reject me because my beliefs are different on this. Because I think we could still learn a lot about each other if we made room for each other in our lives. And hopefully if you have that compassionate approach, they'll realize, okay, you don't hate me just because you don't agree with everything I want you to say. But in the same respect, while I encourage parents to hold the line, hold on to that kid's hand with one hand, hold on to reality with the other hand, in the workplace, you could encounter some different things. Like if you're in charge of human resources and you find out one of the employees has transitioned, and like everybody thinks that that's a woman, and you find out it's actually a man, and they've had surgeries and to change their voice, to add breasts, to makeup, and everybody thinks it's a female. Is it really your job to out the person? Be like, hey, Robert, how you doing? How's he doing? What do you mean he? Oh, you didn't know? Like you can see how that would kind of be a violation of Christian charity to just go out that person and kind of insist upon their thing because it's biologically accurate. That would incinerate any opportunity you could ever have to evangelize that person. And so on that type of situation, you might need to realize, okay, maybe I should try to just avoid the pronoun as much as possible instead of insisting on the biologically accurate one or caving into gender theory. Maybe I can try to avoid the subject as much as possible and go to lunch with the person and love them and just get to know them and walk with them in this. And so to me, it isn't always a black and white kind of thing. Sometimes nuance is needed, but it's if they might resent you for speaking the truth, but honestly, long term, I think they'll resent you for all eternity for never having had the courage to speak the truth to them in love.
I mean, I think that's great advice, especially for parents. I think the problem often tends to be is that when in that discussion between the parents and the children, there are other parties who kind of get involved, especially the kind of professionals. And it seems that what has often been said is that, this non-acceptance will essentially kind of lead to death, basically. I mean, there's sort of question mark as to whether that's even true. But, how do we kind of face that particular question? Basically that if you don't accept them, they're going to commit suicide, or it's very, very likely that they will.
Yeah, you face it with real science. That's what it needs to be faced with, because it's a suicide narrative. If this was actually true, here's what we would see historically. We'd see this really high rate of suicidal ideation amongst transgender youth. It'd be just gigantic. And then we got puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, gender clinics, and gender-affirming surgeries. And that suicide rate just dropped because we had these life-saving interventions. That's what we would see if this was true. What we're actually seeing is the exact opposite of it. We had a suicide rate down here, and now the more puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries you have, the suicide rates are going through the roof. The biggest study that's been done was conducted over there in Sweden. And they found out that about 8 to 10 years post-operation, these individuals had a suicide rate 19 times higher than the general population. If you actually read the patient insert in the package of the puberty blockers, it says that this drug will cause anger, irritability, suicidal ideation, and that the young people become more likely to self-harm after having gone on puberty blockers than they were before going on the puberty blockers. I mean, we're essentially inducing menopause into 15-year-old girls. And they wonder why their moods are all over the place. Well, it must be because of those transphobic parents that won't just call me whatever I want to be called. No, this is why the biggest gender clinic in the United Kingdom, Tavistock, was just shut down, fractured into smaller clinics that actually focus on mental health. 35 of the psychologists there quit because they were not being allowed to explore the deeper psychological issues. If you simply control for all the different factors that are at play here with autism, depression, sexual abuse, trauma, the suicide rate is the same amongst those kids who have those and gender dysphoria, and those things in addition to them. So it's not that if this kid's dysphoric, if you don't call them whatever they want to be called, they're going to kill themselves. This is a very powerful suicide narrative, but it's false. And it explains in part why the Scandinavian countries are changing: Finland, Norway, Sweden, Amsterdam, UK banning puberty blockers. They're not doing it because they're right-wing Christian, transphobic bigots. They're doing it because the literature is in and it's clear. And this is not helping the children. It's harming them.
So, tell us a bit about the puberty blockers then, because one of the chapters in the book is, some people kind of say, oh no, puberty blockers, it's all reversible, and it's just a question of putting something on pause so that you can take the time to think about it.
Yeah.
Is that true?
No, it's completely false. Adolescence is an extremely critical time of bone development in people. If you miss that window of critical bone development, you can't recoup that when you're 23 years old. Like, okay, now I'll develop my bones. That's why we're having 15-year-old kids in the trans community with osteoporosis, breaking their toes and their hips and things like having hip surgery before you even finish high school. And this is so easy. Just Google puberty blockers, osteoporosis. The internet's full of this stuff. The kids who've gone through this, who are now detransitioning, are starting lawsuits against their clinicians of like, why did you not tell me this? Now I'm 22 and I've broken 7 bones because of this since then. It doesn't just pause bone development, it pauses neurological development. We're giving the kids a drug called Lupron, which is given to chemically castrate male sex offenders. And they're giving it to 8-year-old kids saying, well, it's just going to give you more time to discover your gender journey. It's like, wait a minute, this is not a pause button. It's a fast forward button to cross-sex hormones, because 95% of the time when you put a kid on puberty blockers, they just go on to get cross-sex hormones. That's why researchers say this should just be seen as one clinical pathway together, because it's not puberty blockers here, hormones over there. Because if you go on blockers for 4 years and now you're a 15-year-old boy and all your buddies have broader shoulders, deeper voices, and like a 5 o'clock shadow, and you still look like a prepubescent 11-year-old boy, you think you're going to feel more masculine after that stuff? Less. So they go on to the cross-sex hormones, which sterilizes the kid. If you put a kid on puberty blockers right up against cross-sex hormones, it sterilizes the person. They'll never be able to bear children. And this is not on their radar. It's 15, 16, 17 years old. But then they turn 25 and all their friends are breastfeeding and they don't even have breasts anymore. And if they are able to conceive, what's going to happen there? Well, I talk to the people that go through this. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I've listened to the voicemails that they've left on their counselor's voice messages of like, you let me dance in my delusion. Why were you not there? Just to nudge me towards the truth instead of just letting me lead the way for my well-being as a 15-year-old kid struggling with depression. I mean, it's nuts. And so, that's why England is changing its tune on this. It's blocking it. The Amsterdam clinics changing it. Unfortunately, here in the States, I think we're going to need the lawsuits to pile up a little more before we wake up ourselves.
I mean, talking of counselors, I think because on the one hand, in England, we had the CAS report. The National Health Service here has decided to stop prescribing these kind of hormones in most cases. But at the same time, there are laws kind of going through which they say sort of ban conversion therapy. So and under that will also come the possibility of having the kind of talking therapy that could maybe see these kind of confused young people through that period without going on to these very dangerous drugs, essentially. I mean, that seems to me to be one of the areas that doesn't get talked about, I think, enough. How therapists' hands seem to have been really tied in this case. And what do you see any kind of hope on that score?
Yeah, it's unfortunate because it really is. I read one author describe it as a conveyor belt where the kids get taught this stuff in grade school, and then their school has to hide it from the parents that we're going to use this name at school, but you can't tell the parents. And then if the parents find out, there can be lawsuits against them to lose custody over their kid if they don't affirm them in their gender transition. The kid goes to counseling. The counselor can't help the kid identify with their biological sex. Then the doctors have to perform surgeries or potentially lose their license. And so it's this whole conveyor belt that's been set up, sadly, by this legal system. Here in the States, there's more than a dozen states that have laws against conversion therapy. But this is a really loaded term. It kind of implies that there's two pathways. One, which affirms the child and supports them, and the other of this religious, rigorous idea that you need to change the way you feel. And it's like, wait a minute, no. What we're trying to do is help the child feel at home in their own body without having to physically mutilate the child. And that's conversion therapy, of helping them just feel at home in their own body. I was reading a book here about what's going on in the UK. It's called Time to Think. And this was not written by a religious person. This is a secular journalist, Hannah Barnes, and she is basically chronicling the collapse of the Tavistock Clinic. And I remember one thing she said in here was really interesting. One of the psychologists at Tavistock was working with a population of patients who had surgically transitioned and were still having mental health issues. And then he was working with another client group that were adults who wanted to surgically transition. And then he had a thought, what would happen if I just brought the two groups together and they could kind of share their lived experiences and get to know one another? And so he did that. And a fascinating thing happened. 98% of the adults who had previously wanted to surgically transition decided they didn't want surgery anymore, after just spending time with those who had, and realized this did not solve their problems. It created new ones because of the fallout of these surgeries. It's heartbreaking. I know one woman, she said she looked at her total medical bills, and so far it's $1 million so far that insurance has had to pay out for all her different procedures, and then the procedures after the procedures, because all the infections that those things caused, trying to, create these wounds in her body to make her truly who she thinks she is. Yeah. And she realized, wow, this has not been the answer. It just created more problems.
No, I mean, this is somewhat of a family show, so we don't want to go too much into the details. But when you do read about what these surgeries actually kind of entail, it's really incredibly unpleasant stuff. And you can understand why it always leads to more surgery, because this is not how you can treat a body, basically.
Yeah, I've talked to the nurses who actually work in these clinics, and some who are in the post-op, part of the hospital, and they said it's an absolute horror show. I mean, it is so macabre, the things that are being done to these kids' bodies, to these adult bodies. And these procedures, I mean, it's Frankenstein stuff at this point in science right now. And the culture wants to present it like, oh, no, these affirming procedures that are life-saving interventions. But then you talk behind the scenes of what's going on here, and it's heartbreaking what's going on in their bodies. And so I think what's really going to tilt this from a cultural perspective is the sheer volume, a tsunami of lawsuits that are already on the way. I mean, starting with Cara Bell over there in the UK. I mean, she got puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, the surgery. Then she turns 20 and what the heck was that? She sues the Tavistock Clinic, then all the way up to the High Court in England. And these liberal progressive judges ruled in her favor that she could not have had informed consent to make this decision. And so I think it's those kinds of lawsuits that are going to, thanks be to God, shift the cultural tide on this. If you go to websites like reddit.com, you just type in #detrans. There's more than 50,000 detransitioners there screaming from the rooftops. Get the kids off the blockers. Get the kids away from the surgeons. This is not solving our problem. So I think those detransitioners are going to be the ones to save the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a sense, this whole movement, I think, there's enough in the science to really show that it's not a good idea. No. But as Catholics, I think sometimes we, it's important for us to think a bit more deeply about what's really kind of going on here. Why is this happening? We're called to discern the signs of the times. And I mean, we touched on earlier a bit the response that the church has had to this, and the document you can see behind me here, Dignitas Infinita, is the first kind of real magisterial response from the church that actually deals with this this issue head on. I mean, were you happy with this first magisterial pronouncement on the topic? Did you think it went far enough? I mean, there's a few paragraphs that I think are quite strong, in their kind of restatement of the church's teaching on the human person, the dignity of the human person. And I think one thing that it sort of says that I think is very interesting is that the biggest diversity, the biggest difference there is between human beings is that sexual dimorphism. There's nothing more different. The difference between a black person and a white person is far smaller than between a man and a woman.
Yes.
And so that's something that we need to think about. But how do you feel about the church's response? What would you like the church to do in future? And from the perspective of a believer, I mean, what do we really think is going on here?
Yeah, I think
those are big questions, but I mean, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I think what's missing right now is the pastoral application of these eternal theological truths. Like, okay, we know what the church teaches on this thing, but okay, what are the pastoral strategies that a principal or a parent or a pastor could implement if they've got a kid or a student, that identifies as non-binary or trans? How do we make those people feel that there's room for them in the church as they navigate these difficult questions of sexual identity? That it's not like, okay, well, get your act together and, put on a nice pink dress with bows in your hair, and then you can come into church. If that's the case, then a lot of these young girls struggling to like, okay, well then, bye, I'm not showing up. There's no room for me in the church to navigate this. So how do we walk with them? Because you look at the priests now, none of them went to the seminary and learned, how to accompany non-binary parishioners. Like it just wasn't on the radar. And so now we've got them in the youth group or we've got them in the community. And it's like, okay, what do we do here? Like, how do we actually walk with this person? I remember reading one Protestant pastor and he said, look, if there's a member in your community that identifies as trans and you meet the person, what do you do? What do you say to him? He said, I would just recommend saying, hey, I feel like I'm meeting you in chapter 8 of your life, but I haven't had the opportunity to learn about chapters 1 through 7, but I'd really like to. Can we get coffee? Like, that's the answer. The answer isn't to like, okay, I'm going to win this argument with this just silver bullet apologetic proof out of DNA that's going to convince you, oh, well, great. Now I feel at home in my own body because I understand genetics. Like, no. There's layers to this. We've got to walk with these individuals in truth and love. We've got to accompany the parents who are just heartbroken over this thing, because a lot of times they feel like they're not only losing their child, but they're losing dreams. They're losing their grandkids. It's like, okay, wait a minute. My son is going to have that surgery. Like, I'll never have grandkids now. And then what am I going to do when he wants to show up at a family reunion dressed up as a woman? Like, there's so much accompaniment and sensitivity that's needed on this issue for the whole family, not just the people living with those identifying as trans, but those individuals who identify as trans. Okay, do they feel seen by the church? Do they feel loved by the church? That's our job to do that, making sure that the way we talk about this subject is with reverence and not just kind of an us, them mentality. But it's like, look, all of us struggle with our sexuality in one way or another. It might be like, am I the man or the husband God wants me to be? Or maybe it's, I struggle with my sexuality as a behavior, not so much as an identity. Like, we're all wrestling in this together. The whole church isn't, like they say, a museum of saints. It's more a hospital of sinners. So our job is to make them feel that this is your home too, and that we love you. Christ sees you. In fact, he's the only one that truly sees you, and he loves you.
Yeah, but practically speaking, that really does raise issues that we've never seen before, really, in the church. No? And I suppose we need to ask the Holy Spirit to inspire us. How best to answer that. And I think those questions are ahead of us. But I think in the meantime, we've had we've had a good kind of platform from which to build. I think in this latest document. I mean, do you see things kind of being clarified further in the future in the church's teaching, or do you think that we've got we kind of have the tools at our disposal to answer this?
I mean, I think having a more robust pastoral document would be certainly helpful. In the meantime, there are resources that parents, educators, and priests could use. There's a website called personandidentity.com. So personandidentity.com. They've got templates of policies that schools could implement that could explain, okay, at our school, this is our policy when it comes to bathrooms and names and pronouns. And if you want to send your kid to our school, great. But this is what we teach on these things. And so don't come to us upset if we're not going to use your kid's preferred pronoun or let your boy into the girl's bathroom, because you already signed the parent handbook and these are our values as a school. Schools need to come up with these templates instead of simply being reactionary to the problems of like, okay, we got a 7th grader who wants to go with the girls' retreat. Like, what do we do here? Let's get these policies in place. And so personandidentity.com is a good website for that. Our website is chastity.com. And if you go to chastity.com/gender, we've got all kinds of resources there as well for parents, educators, and even people who do experience gender dysphoria as well.
No, brilliant. So, I mean, we're really looking forward to being able to present your book to the public here in the UK. It'll have a preface which gives a bit more of a kind of sort of sit rep of how things are going in the UK and situating it in the context that we have here. By Stefan Kaminsky, who runs a great institute up in the north of England. But I mean, I really want to thank you for your work on this. It's a fantastic book, very timely, and you've approached a subject which many people where angels fear to tread, but you've gone in there with a great amount of I think sympathy and scholarly rigor as well. So I want to thank you for that, and we're kind of very privileged to be able to publish it here. So thanks very much for all you do, Jason. So where's the best place for people to follow your work?
They can just go to chastity.com. If they're on social media, the handles on Instagram and Twitter is just at Jason Evert, or YouTube, it's just Jason Evert. So we're always putting out new content on that. We've done multiple episodes on our podcast, which is called Lust is Boring. One recently, I interviewed a detransitioner, Chloe Cole, because I think people need to hear this. So you realize you're not the bad guy. If you feel like the church is right on this, like, we need to speak out of love for these people. We can't afford to be silent. It's not like I got to be quiet because I'm some hateful person. It's not like, no, if you hated these people, you would be quiet and you would let them just be consumed by this culture. It's out of love that we need to speak, that this is not the answer to hurt your body in order to be your authentic self. God did not make a mistake when he created you, and he loves you, and that's clear. What God's plan for you may be walking forward. Let's discover that together.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. I think the most memorable podcast title I've heard in a while. I'll definitely be looking that one up. So thank you very much, Jason, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you.